begin with, thank you very much for joining us today for Erin Jessee's talk. My name is Alessandro Bucci. I'm the director of the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association and the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Center. We are on the campus of the University of Huddersfield. So if you are in and around Yorkshire, do come and see us. And I'm here on behalf of the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. The Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership aims to reframe public engagement, education, and heritage practice about the history and memory of the Holocaust and genocide. It does so by bringing together scholars, educators, and cultural practitioners for research-led public learning and understanding, and aims to build a dynamic and culturally inclusive research vision to ensure that public knowledge of the Holocaust and genocide is shaped by expert knowledge and the voices of survivors. I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce Dr. Erin Jessee, who is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Glasgow, where she uses oral history and ethnographic methods to engage with people's diverse experiences of genocide and related mass atrocities, particularly in Rwanda. She is the author of Negotiating Genocide in Rwanda, The Politics of History. She's the co-editor of Researching Perpetrators of Genocide, and has published articles with Medical History, Memory Studies, Oral History Review, History in Africa, and Forensic Science International, among others. If you have any questions at all during the talk or after the talk, please send them, write them in the chat, and we will then ask them to our guest today, to Erin. So without further ado, Erin, welcome to the HGRP.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alessandro, and to the team behind the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership for inviting me to speak today and for organizing this event. I really appreciate it. So the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is currently part of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Atrocity Crimes, which is co-edited by Barbora, Holá, Hollie, Nyseth, Brehm, and Maartje Weerdesteijn. This sort of explains the focus on atrocity crimes and also the sort of discussion that I'll be offering today around this idea of role shifting amid genocide and related atrocities. I was invited to prepare a chapter for this volume that would prompt scholars to begin thinking and writing about atrocity crimes, which is an umbrella term that's used in the field of genocide studies, among others, to include things like the legal prohibitions around genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, among other kinds of really sort of serious human rights violations. And sort of within this discussion of atrocity crimes then, there's a tendency for scholars and practitioners to rely on what are increasingly coming to be recognized as these kinds of overly simplistic categories of actors that have been identified as kind of central to episodes of genocide internationally. And these archetypes, these sort of categories are those of the survivor, the bystander, and the perpetrator. And so in this chapter, I'm sort of exploring the idea that in some circumstances, by treating these categories as distinct or separate, we might risk inadvertently promoting an overly simplistic view of how genocides and other atrocities emerge within a society, how they can transform people's lives as they're sort of unfolding. And then, of course, understandings of the long-term legacies of these kinds of violence for not just individuals, but even entire societies in the atrocities aftermath. And as part of this, then, one of the ideas that I'm sort of grappling with in this chapter is this possibility that the oversimplistic framing of these categories that we often see in some academic research, but more commonly, I think, in popular culture, has maybe the potential to at times undermine the stated benefits of transitional justice initiatives that are aimed at promoting social repair, and in some cases as well can perpetuate lasting harms for individuals and communities who've endured genocidal violence. So this is just a little bit of the context behind the presentation that I'm giving today. And so from that perspective, then the chapter that I've written is very much grounded in decades of research emerging from fields of Holocaust studies, genocide studies, atrocity crimes, and conflict studies. And as a sort of starting point for research design for the analysis of what's happening in these kinds of contexts, I'm arguing for approaching people, broadly speaking, whose lives have been intimately affected by genocides and related mass atrocities as what I call complex political actors. And as I said, this is really just meant to be a starting point. It doesn't necessarily mean this is where we end up with our analysis, but just in terms of how we begin approaching people in these contexts. And this is a term then that sort of brings together the work of two political scientists, the first being Erica Boris, who a few years ago now introduced the idea of a complex political victim to address individuals who are seen as victims in the aftermath of genocide, as well as survivors in some instances, and then in different ways are able to sort of use this label to advocate for themselves and begin working toward resilience and so on in the aftermath. Though, of course, at times there can be negative connotations associated with taking on this label as well. Sometimes it's put on them rather than something they choose. And then the second political scientist then that this idea draws upon is the work of Erin Baines, who talks about the concept of the complex political perpetrator. And these are individuals then who are drawn into participating in atrocities, committing atrocities then, but also simultaneously in some ways being victims themselves. And the example then that Erin Baines uses as to sort of exemplify the complex political perpetrator is the former commander of the LRA, Dominic Ongwen, who of course was a child soldier who was forced then to join the LRA, but later became a very high level perpetrator within the organization. And broadly speaking then, their work encourages researchers and other kinds of professionals to approach atrocity affected people as whole people whose existence, whose identities are determined by more than just their experience of genocide. And in the process, recognizing the at times very powerful agency that conflict affected people can exercise in adopting or resisting these labels, and particularly the labels of the survivor, victim, and also the perpetrator. And to be clear, this approach then does not advocate for regarding all people's actions in genocidal contexts as being morally or legally equivalent, okay? So it's not about putting everybody on the same playing field. Instead, it's arguing for a very sensitive approach, one that involves really careful political, historical, and legal contextualization, and particularly when working with conflict-affected people's life histories and other kinds of really intimate information experiences. Likewise, I think this kind of very sensitive approach is especially important when researchers are working across different lines of a conflict. So where you have a study that is simultaneously involving working with, say, survivors, bystanders, perpetrators, and other really key actors within a conflict. But the hope is that if this is kind of carefully applied as a starting point for the research design, for the analysis and so on, it will allow the researcher to then get a better sense of the full spectrum of people's actions amid mass atrocities, and then also acknowledge and begin to sort of develop theories around, the extensive role shifting that can occur amid genocides and related mass atrocities. And in the process, then one of the goals is to be able to then push back against these kinds of overly simplistic representations that often emerge in genocide's aftermath, particularly where these might be harmful to survivors, but also other kinds of actors. So to demonstrate the potential of this approach, I apply this idea of complex political actors to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, which is known in official parlance in Rwanda and by some international organizations as well as the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And so this is a period then, just to give you a little bit more context, during which Hutu power extremists, so these are extremists affiliated with the nation's Hutu majority, attempted to annihilate the nation's ethnic Tutsi minority, as well as their supporters in politics. And my work on this subject then is informed by nearly 15 years now of experience conducting in-depth qualitative research with Rwandans who in the aftermath of the genocide came to be identified according to one of these, very sort of strictly delineated archetypes. And in the Rwandan context, then, these are the archetypes of the innocent survivor, the heroic combatant, and the guilty perpetrator. And again, just to give you a little bit of context then on what I mean or what is meant in using these terms in the Rwandan context, it's important to note, first of all, that in Rwanda, people tend to reserve the term victim for those individuals who were murdered, disappeared, harmed irreparably to the point where they became, very much dependent on other people in the aftermath of the genocide. And it's often used in ways then that are quite distinct from that of the genocide survivor, which tends to then reference predominantly Tutsi, in many cases only Tutsi civilians, who either experienced the genocide sort of firsthand and then were able to escape, or whose immediate families were living in Rwanda during the genocide while they themselves were temporarily abroad. And in the way that then it's used in Rwanda, it tends to then exclude the possibility of Hutu or Tutsi genocide survivors, because of course the genocide was very much an attempt to exterminate the Tutsi minority within the country. Terms like combatant and ex-combatant then are typically used in reference to those individuals who fought with the Rwandan Patriotic Army, or RPA. This is the military wing of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, which currently leads the government in Rwanda. And then often with individuals who fought for the RPA, they were either demobilized, in which case they're ex-combatants now, or they've been incorporated into the Rwandan military, the Rwandan Defense Forces. And it's important to note then that while in some instances there's evidence to suggest that some RPA soldiers, while the genocide was going on, but also maybe before and after, may have engaged in crimes against humanity and war crimes, at the same time, the way that these are regarded by the Rwandan government is that these were very much individual crimes. So to be clear, this was not part of a massive pattern on the part of the RPF or criminal intent on the part of the RPF to harm civilians. Rather, these were individual crimes that were very much motivated by the extreme psychological distress that some soldiers experienced after witnessing the horrible atrocities that Hutu power extremists perpetrated against Tutsi civilians during the genocide. And so in this way then, combatants and ex-combatants are seen as being very much different, set properly apart from the people today who are regarded as what's called in Rwanda Génocidaires. And this is a distinctly Kinyarwandan term then that's used to reference those individuals who perpetrated specifically genocide-related crimes in 1994. And for this reason is then typically reserved for Hutu individuals. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what these terms are about in the Rwandan context. And then these are terms then, or labels, that are frequently used in the Rwandan context to kind of summarize people's experiences surrounding the genocide, as well as their post-genocide status. And each of these terms then carries certain moral and legal connotations that can really impact on people's post-genocide lives in quite powerful and tangible ways, even as the nation moves towards, national unity and reconciliation. And yet, despite the fact that the way that these terms are often used in sort of common parlance within Rwanda, throughout my research on the genocide, I often found that very few of the Rwandans that I was speaking to regarded themselves or others in their communities as sort of neatly fitting these labels. And indeed, many of the people that I interviewed, that I spoke with during my time in Rwanda over the years, actually felt that, for example, it would be more appropriate to sort of talk about the way that people shifted between these categories at different points relating to the genocide. And indeed, this is then the reason why, for the purpose of this chapter, I'm talking about this idea of role shifting. This was an idea then that was very much prevalent in the interviews that I conducted with Rwandans who'd lived through the genocide. And so in the chapter that underlies this presentation, I center the life histories of 3 individuals with whom I worked to kind of demonstrate where this idea of role shifting comes from and why it might be relevant to the context of Rwanda. And I'm using it then to sort of describe the ways that people would sometimes move between or sometimes simultaneously engage in actions that kind of cross these perceived boundaries, this tidy delineation between the sort of victim survivors, bystanders, combatants, and then perpetrators. And in order to do this then, I talk in some detail about the life histories of, first of all, a young man named Innocent. And I should mention as well, these are all pseudonyms that I'm using because people requested anonymity. So Innocent was very much a survivor of the Rwandan genocide and therefore of Tutsi heritage. The second person I talk about in the chapter is Patrick, an ex-combatant who had fought with the Rwandan Patriotic Army during the Civil War and genocide. And then the third person I talk about in the chapter is a man named Roger, who was a convicted perpetrator at the time, at least when we met, and who had very much perpetrated atrocities during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. So given time constraints today, I'm trying to kind of keep this to about 30 minutes or so. I'm not going to go into the life histories of all three of these individuals in this presentation. Instead, I'm hoping to just focus really on Innocent and followed by Roger. So to begin just with a brief overview of Innocent's life history, it's important to note he was very much a child at the time of the genocide, and he lost almost his entire extended family in the first days of these atrocities. He himself was then actively targeted on multiple occasions by Hutu power extremists as he tried to survive. And for these reasons, I mean, to look at him, to talk to him, to talk to the people he worked with, in many ways, he really clearly fits the archetype of the innocent survivor. And indeed, you know, the people around him seem to kind of hold him up as such, even though he very rarely spoke about his past and his experiences of the genocide. But in the context of these interviews that I conducted with him, and having time to sort of talk about the genocide, reflect on the genocide in his own terms, Innocent acknowledged that in order to negotiate his survival during the genocide, he actually had to engage in a lot of different activities, which in the aftermath, he felt very ashamed about. And most notably, the sort of incident that he referred to relates to this period after he'd sort of lost all the adults in his life. He ended up joining up with a group of street kids whom he managed to convince he was Hutu. And, you know, when they sort of asked what had happened to his family, he basically said, you know, well, they were killed by accident, but they weren't actually Tutsi, our family is Hutu. And they accepted this. They accepted him into their sort of community. And going forward then, while he was with them, they assumed that he was then Hutu. And this afforded him a bit of protection. It meant that he was no longer vulnerable to attacks by Hutu power extremists, like he might have been if he'd remained sort of on his own. But this also meant then that he was sort of brought into this community where these street kids were often expected to prove themselves to be good Hutu by the standards of the Hutu power extremists within their community. And this became, of course, as you can imagine, extremely challenging for Innocent, because as time went on, he was basically increasingly pushed to engage in this kind of choiceless decision-making, as it's referred to by anthropologist Begonia Arhaga, to engage in at times criminal activities to ensure his survival. And while it was very much necessary for his survival then in the moment of the genocide, upon reflection, he did feel quite ashamed. And it caused him to actually question his innocence as a survivor in the post-genocide period. He recognized, you know, on one hand that the genocide was this unspeakably awful period in Rwandan history, and that as a child he had, you know, very, very few options for survival. He couldn't really physically defend himself, for example. And yet, you know, he then spoke about lying about his ethnic heritage, about his family, things like begging for money, stealing food and clothing from people, some of whom were themselves Tutsi who were trying to escape, you know, the genocidal violence. All of this, you know, he admitted caused him great shame. And his sense of shame then really peaked when, toward the end of one interview, he admitted that the street kids he associated with during these few weeks frequently were called upon to participate in the killing of Tutsi at roadblocks. and in some cases, then demonstrating great enthusiasm when they encountered someone they regarded as having been too proud or ungenerous to them, and so on. And so I didn't ask Innocent whether he ever participated in these murders. It seemed a really painful subject for him to talk about, and I felt it important to respect the silences he remained around, that he maintained around it. But at the same time, like, he would return to this again and again and again. And he admitted at one point that, you know, he did everything he felt he had to do to convince the street kids that he was one of them, that he was a Hutu like them, and that he was a good Hutu at that. And again, by the standards of Hutu power extremists, not necessarily, you know, the standards of what it might mean to be a good Hutu, you know, during peace times. And yeah, I mean, this could have then been an indirect admission that, I mean, certainly that he'd witnessed these atrocities, but he may have also been a bystander to them and perhaps even complicit in some of these murders, if not an active participant. And so it really sort of complicated in his own, you know, understanding, you know, the extent to which he should be regarded as a kind of innocent survivor. And this is something, I mean, Innocent's case is quite an extreme example, but this is a phenomenon that I encountered among many of the survivors that I interviewed. And they typically talked about these challenges in kind of off the record conversations. So, you know, they knew that I was a researcher, they knew that I was taking notes, but they didn't necessarily want to talk about these things ever in public. And they certainly didn't, you know, feel comfortable, say, being recorded and so on. And these were also very difficult things for them to recount, even though at times they really felt it was something they needed to talk about. They sort of often talked about, you know, needing to kind of clean their conscience, and that it was cathartic for them to speak about these kinds of things. And in some cases, then this included things they were forced to do by Hutu power extremists. In other times, it was things that they felt they had to do in order to survive in other ways, you know, acquiring food and you know, medical aid and these kinds of things. And in many cases as well, it seemed like they were forced to do these things by the Hutu power extremists as a way of demoralizing Tutsi and dehumanizing them in ways that would negatively impact them in the event that they were able to survive the genocide. So it sometimes also seemed like this was very much part of the kind of criminal intent of individual perpetrators, if not, you know, select groups of Interahamwe and so on, who were the youth militias who were often on the front lines of this violence. And so while I struggle to sort of imagine that reasonable people would regard, you know, survivors of the genocide who had to engage in these kinds of actions as being criminally responsible, or you know, that they should be prosecuted for these kinds of crimes, particularly when it's so clear that they were under such extreme duress in the context of the genocide. I still think these narratives are really, really significant because they tell us about how survivors make sense of the genocide, their own like potential complicity in atrocities that would have occurred, and also very much their sense of survivor's guilt in the aftermath. And this, of course, is very important because it can speak to some of the forms of emotional distress that survivors end up navigating in the aftermath, even, you know, decades after the atrocities have formally ended. And in Innocent's case, the effects of these choiceless decisions that he was forced to make as a survivor left him feeling really suicidal. And even during the genocide, he decided at one point to leave the street kids. He went to a local stadium because he felt he would certainly be killed by going to the stadium. But he actually managed to then escape again, survive the genocide, of course. In the aftermath, then, he became a primary caregiver for the surviving children from his extended family. And then went on to work in supporting other genocide survivors, helping them to establish a renewed sense of community where families had been destroyed and this kind of thing. And he was very much dedicated to the idea of eschewing ethnic identities in post-genocide Rwanda. He really wanted to promote, you know, ideals that supported national unity and reconciliation and so on. So he was very much committed to that. And indeed, we met through a survivors organization where he worked and where he was doing great work supporting vulnerable people. But he did talk about finding the label of the survivor and this kind of prominent archetype of the innocent survivor in particular, you know, his connotations of moral superiority and so on, everything that comes along with it, had a really, really powerful emotional weight upon him. And he often then felt that it was just impossible for him to find ways to actually talk about what had really made his survival possible, these choiceless decisions that he'd engaged in. And from our conversations then, it seemed like at times the moments in his experience of the genocide's aftermath where his survival kind of hinged upon his ability to role shift from a survivor to kind of a bystander, or perhaps even a perpetrator by Rwandan standards, really did then weigh heavily on him. And at times as well seemed to then exacerbate the other negative effects that he experienced as a result of the extraordinary genocidal violence that he had endured at the hands of the Hutu power extremists. So, for these reasons, I think, very, very significant, very, very important. I'll now turn to the case of Roger to highlight some of the challenges that potentially surround uncritical use of the kind of guilty perpetrator archetype. So upon meeting Roger in the prison where he was awaiting the results of his latest trial, it's important to note that as someone coming from forensics and sort of studies of transitional justice, going into the Rwandan prisons, I was really very much prepared to be meeting with people who are essentially, kind of evil monsters. The fact that they could engage in these kinds of crimes, which, for most of us are just completely unthinkable. I mean, that tends to be the kind of standard that most people have in mind. If you can commit these crimes, you're a monster, and often senseless, and so on and so on. And yet, Roger, in a lot of ways, didn't really seem to fit this expectation that I had. He was quite soft-spoken, he was quite respectful, and in trying to narrate his life history, he often seemed quite kind of confused, as well as very remorseful about how he had come to be a génocidaire. And he began his life history by talking about this relatively peaceful childhood he'd had in southern Rwanda, where he'd been born to a relatively wealthy family. And his father in particular was quite important in the narrative of his early life, because throughout earlier periods of ethnic and political violence in Rwanda, Roger claimed that his father had actually helped to rescue Tutsi who were being attacked. And for this reason, was much loved in the community and so on. And for these reasons then, Roger said that he basically grew up not really believing in ethnic divisionism. And indeed then when, the RPF invaded Rwanda in 1990, this effectively triggered a civil war. Roger actually chose alongside his father to join the Social Democratic Party, the PSD, because they wanted to fight the kind of extremism and so on that was gaining traction within this Hutu-dominated government of then President Juvenal Habyarimana, as well as in their immediate community. And as the civil war continued, Roger claimed that he and his father were at times forced into hiding because they were actually targeted then by Hutu power extremists for being kind of ibietso, these spies or accomplices of the enemy. And then, of course, things escalated even further when, after Habyarimana's assassination on the 6th of April, 1994, which is one of the triggers then for the start of the genocide, members of PSD and other political opposition groups, they were among some of the first victims of the atrocities. They were attacked by Hutu power extremists as a way of obliterating the political opposition in Rwanda. And so at this point, Roger and his family actually went into hiding until around the 20th of April, at which point the violence in the community seemed to have shifted away from political moderates to focus exclusively on Tutsi civilians. So they felt that they might then be safe to come out of hiding. And at this point, they thought about fleeing, but Roger claimed they decided not to because they worried that if they then tried to move and they were then in a community where they weren't well known and where they didn't have good relationships, they would still be targeted in this violence. And so staying in their community then, Roger claimed that despite significant risk to himself and his family, he worked with his father to hide Tutsi family, friends, and co-workers in different places, including his own home. The local Interahamwe, which is the name for one of the sort of Hutu power youth militia groups that was often on the front lines of this violence, they insisted that each family be sending at least one man to help with night patrols, to maintain the roadblocks and these kinds of things. But basically his family was able to avoid contributing to this by giving the Interahamwe money. And this also meant then that they could bribe the Interahamwe not to sort of search their properties and their home. But he then claimed about a week or so later, soldiers arrived having been tipped off by neighbors that there were Tutsi hiding in Roger's home. He claimed that, he felt that he would be killed, his family would be killed if they refused. And so he agreed to basically escort the two people hiding in his home to the roadblock. As they walked, Roger was forced to carry a machete, and when they arrived at the roadblock, he was then forced by the extremists to use this machete to kill one of the two people, or help kill one of the two people that he had been trying to rescue. And after that, then Roger was expected to attend the roadblocks every day, again, to sort of demonstrate that he was a good Hutu by Hutu power standards, and help sort of protect the community, and other sort of euphemistic language that they often used. Nonetheless, he claimed he didn't believe in the propaganda he was being exposed to during this time, nor did he ever particularly want to fight the Tutsi. But he had to go to the roadblock, and he was very clear about this. He ultimately then lost track of how many Tutsi he helped to kill in this capacity, in this so-called work at the roadblocks. Though he did claim that in these acts of killing, he tried to be merciful and give people what he called a good death, by which he meant, a quick death, and one that didn't involve, torture, mutilation of remains, and other things that were often quite common among the Hutu power extremists who were more ideologically motivated, so that, the victims' spirits would have a better chance of resting peacefully in the afterlife. Similarly, Roger claimed that he never raped Tutsi women. This was another thing that was quite common during the genocide. And that when in May 1994, the local authorities told people that women had no ethnicity and that they could begin taking Tutsi women as wives. And this, of course, is a kind of forced marriage that is regarded very much as a kind of sexual violence. He then refused to accept this so-called reward that he was being offered. Soon after the genocide ended, Roger, having been very visible at the roadblocks, was immediately identified to the RPF as someone who played a key role in killings. And he accepted this. He said, he recognized that he had caused great harm to the country and that he needed to account for these crimes. And when it was his turn to attend Gacaca, which is a sort of reinvented dispute resolution mechanism indigenous to Rwanda, he claimed that he confessed his crimes freely and apologized to the surviving loved ones of those he harmed because he wanted to support national unity and reconciliation. So when we met, he was serving a sentence for some genocide-related crimes and was waiting sentencing for others. And yet he sort of expressed this kind of hopefulness that his complicated position, this sort of way that he'd also simultaneously acted as a rescuer, a resistor, but also a perpetrator, would be taken into account in determining his sentences. And of course, especially because he felt he was very much forced to become a perpetrator through duress by Hutu power extremists in his community. But that said, of course, he worried about his trial's outcome because none of the people that he claimed to have tried to rescue survived the genocide, and because most of his friends, his neighbors, his extended family had distanced themselves from him after his arrest because of the moral stain that comes with being identified in public as a génocidaire. And he feared that as a result of this, the way he'd been kind of cut off, judged prior to trial, all these kinds of things, he feared that as a result, he would then be regarded solely as a perpetrator, which is often the case with people who are convicted or imprisoned for genocide-related crimes. And that none of his alleged efforts to rescue people or resist the genocide in his community would be considered in determining appropriate sentences. So Roger's complex narrative of perpetration, the role shifting that it allegedly entailed, it wasn't uncommon. These kinds of patterns weren't uncommon, again, among the convicted genocidaires that I interviewed. Indeed, in the ways that they presented themselves to me, I encountered very few people in the prisons who I could comfortably categorize as, these kind of evil monsters or anything else, pure perpetrators, who celebrated and were remorseless of the atrocities that they perpetrated. Far more common were narratives of people like Roger, who argued that their lives had been completely upended during the Civil War, sometimes including personal losses, the murder of loved ones by combatant groups, and who had subsequently then been sort of drawn into the Hutu power extremist agenda, or for other reasons came to regard the torture, the murder, the mutilation of the Tutsi during the genocide as normalized and permissible, perhaps even desirable, such that they too began to participate in the violence. And similarly common were perpetrators' accounts of alleged rescues, both successful. Some people said, there's this person who's alive today you can go and speak to who I rescued, but also the failed ones where people ended up being killed anyways. And these were often specific to people, to Tutsi, that they knew personally and recognized posed them no threat, and often occurred simultaneous to them then engaging in killing Tutsi they did not personally know, or with whom they had a history of interpersonal conflict and these kinds of things. And while this should not, diminish the brutality the crimes that they perpetrated and you know, the sentencing and so, or sorry, and the way that we sort of regard them as people. And indeed should be, I think, regarded critically as researchers as a possible strategy that perpetrators might employ in some instances to try to justify or minimize their crimes, for example. It nonetheless points, I think, to a need to try to develop a more nuanced framework for making sense of the kinds of shifting actions that perpetrators might engage with surrounding genocides. And so just by way of a conclusion then, in speaking about innocent Roger's firsthand experience of the genocide, I mean, I think there is evidence here that while there may occasionally be cases of people who neatly fit these archetypes of the innocent survivor and guilty perpetrator archetypes surrounding the genocide in Rwanda and, you know, in examples beyond Rwanda as well, it's important to note that many Rwandans will understand their actions and those of their compatriots in more complicated terms, and sometimes consider these labels to then be inaccurate, at times painful for them to negotiate, given the political, social capital that's often associated with them. I acknowledge, I mean, in Rwanda at the moment, there isn't a huge amount of space in public context for people to begin talking about things like role shifting during genocide in a meaningful way. And yet, you know, beneath the kind of surface, among many of the Rwandans that I've interviewed over the years, they live, you know, in these densely populated and quite tight-knit communities. And if not for that reason, certainly because of the Gacaca trials that occurred across the country, they tend to have this really, really striking awareness of exactly what all of their neighbors did during the genocide, as well as, you know, throughout other periods of Rwanda's past. And one sentiment that was increasingly and consistently expressed by the Rwandans with whom I've interviewed over the years, regardless of ethnicity, political affiliation, position relative to the genocide, and so on, is that really they're willing to, you know, accept anything as long as it helps to prevent future ethnic and political bloodshed. And this sort of common goal then, you know, is perhaps an indication that maybe there is fertile ground, or there will be soon fertile ground for discussion of the ways that Rwandans engaged in this kind of role shifting during the genocide. But that said, I also recognize that in these kinds of contexts, especially again, where you have these tight-knit communities, having these discussions would be a very, very messy and at times, I think, very, very painful process for people from different sides of the conflict to engage in, because of course it means acknowledging that, you know, they've perhaps engaged in things that they don't want to admit to themselves, let alone others. Beyond the Rwandan context, there's a general trend in genocide studies, in studies of atrocity crimes and so on, that suggests that this focus or this emergent sort of interest in role shifting and this idea of complex political actors may have merit. There's also quite a bit of support, especially within the emergent field of perpetrator studies, for sort of looking beyond labels of the perpetrator because of how politicized this idea of the perpetrator can be in different contexts. It doesn't seem to be opening up, though, in studies of survivors and other kinds of actors in the same way, beyond, of course, notable exceptions like Primo Levi's work on the Holocaust, and specifically, you know, what he wrote on Sonderkommandos in the context of Nazi concentration camps. But certainly at present, there seems to be recognition that we need to find more nuanced ways to deal with the role shifting that occurs in genocidal atrocities, as part to help try to prevent future atrocities, but also in part to try to mitigate the negative legacies of the resulting atrocities, the resulting humanitarian crises and the other sort of aftermaths of this kinds of violence. And so I think I'm about at time there, so I'm going to go ahead and stop, but I'm looking forward to your comments and questions now in the discussion period. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erin. Just to say, my name is Christine Schmidt. I'm from the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and we're part of the HGRP as well. And I just wanted to thank you on behalf of our partners for a fantastic presentation and a very challenging one, and very interesting. And while I wait for questions to come into the chat, just to say, if you have a question, please feel free to post it in the chat, either directly to me or to one of the co-hosts, and we will feed it back to Dr. Jessee. If I could just start with one question that I had, does this chapter, I mean, you started at the beginning of your presentation talking about these archetypes and these very sort of simplistic categories of perpetrator, victim, bystander. And you mentioned that it this is primarily or very commonly used in popular culture. Do you sort of trace the kind of origins of these ideas in this chapter and where this sort of simplistic categorization comes from and why it's so commonly used? I mean, it's interesting because you also sort of premised both of your examples saying that they challenged your own sort of thinking about it, which probably came from these categories in some ways. So I was curious if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, this is a really challenging topic. I mean, it's taken me years to begin writing about these kinds of things, just because I've been trying to sort of also figure out in my own mind how to make sense of it in a way that doesn't infringe upon the dignity of the people I've worked with, and I think especially genocide survivors, because it's really important in having these conversations that we're not taking anything away from people who have already been through such horrific experiences. I don't really engage with the origins of these terms sort of in terms of, say, genocide and mass atrocities, other than to just note that, this tends to be something that we've identified sort of since the origins of genocide studies in the field, really in the 70s. But no, I don't go into it in a huge amount of detail. There are other scholars who have. I can think of Leanne Fuji's work, for example. There's an article that she's published where she talked a little bit about sort of the origins of these ideas. And I think Shell Anderson as well in his book on perpetrators, not just in Rwanda, but I think he's comparing about 7 or 8 different examples of genocidal atrocities around the world. And in that, I think also he sort of talks about, at least as far as perpetrators are concerned, where this idea of the guilty sort of perpetrator, the evil monster, and so on comes from in pop culture. But yeah, I mean, I just sort of reference these previous scholars, very much standing on the shoulders of giants in that regard, rather than digging into it myself. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Erin. We've had another question come in. I'm still looking at my chat. And of course, my co-host, please feel free to jump in if a question has come directly to you. Hold on, let me just scroll to it because it's a bit further back. Dan Stone is asking, it's a bit outside the scope of your presentation, but it's relevant to this in terms of the predominance of reductionist narratives of Rwanda and of genocides in general. And he was wondering what you think of current scholarly attempts to allegedly prove that the figure of about 1 million Tutsis killed in the genocide, and this is in the scholarly, obviously not in Dan's, he's quoting that there, about 1 million Tutsis killed in the genocide is very much an overestimation. This is in this scholarly discourse, which is put to use by the Kagame government. And do you think that scholars like Fairvim, McDoom, etc., who have revised the figures downwards are making a positive contribution to the scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a provocative question, because of course, I mean, there are reasons why, the Rwandan government is really invested in this idea of 1 million people, predominantly Tutsi, who were victims during the genocide. There's also reasons why scholars on the other side would want to reduce that number down, right? And also focus, I think, on not just, say, Tutsi victims of the genocide, but also Hutu and Twa victims of other kinds of atrocities that were occurring in Rwanda, right? So it's a really highly politicized debate, and one that's honestly quite challenging, I think, at times to sort of see your way through. I mean, I'm familiar with, the government's case for why it would be over 1 million Tutsi victims. I'm also familiar with some of the arguments around why it would, say, be only 500,000. And fundamentally, it seems to come down to a lack of reliable data on how many Tutsi were living in the Rwanda at the time of the genocide, as well as how many Tutsi survived compared to, say, how many Tutsi would have come back into Rwanda. There are also, very poor numbers and understandings of how many other Rwandan civilians, Hutu and Twa civilians, were killed during this period, because documentation during these atrocities was very hit and miss. I mean, the most recent effort I've seen to grapple with this comes from, I think it was a 2020 forum in the Journal for Genocide Research, which I'm sure Dr. Stone's familiar with, where I think it was Jens Mayer Henrik finally sort of brought it all together and concluded that likely the estimates of about 500,000 Tutsi victims of the genocide were most accurate. But whether that's making a significant contribution to the scholarship, again, this is another question, because with genocide, it shouldn't matter how many people have died, right? How many people have been killed. If one individual is killed with genocidal intent on the part of the perpetrator, like, fitting all the other criteria of that individual being killed because they're perceived to be a member of an unwanted ethnic, national, racial, religious group, right? That should be genocide in itself. So I'm not sure these conversations around numbers are particularly helpful. And I also worry sometimes that they're received by survivors, again, in ways that are quite negative. So yeah, but I'm also, admittedly, I'm not a numbers person. Again, I'm more interested in the quality of people's experiences and how they navigate those and these kinds of things. So if I was a quantitative scholar, I'd probably give a very, very different response. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, but I'm happy to answer follow-ups on that as well, or speak to follow-ups on that as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple other questions. Okay. One participant asking if you know the work of Michael Rothberg, the implicated subject beyond victims and perpetrators, and if so, what connections do you see between your concept of complex political actors and his subject of the implicated, his concept of the implicated subject?
I'm actually not, no. I mean, I've only just recently gotten his book on multidirectional memory, so I'm engaging with that at the moment. But no, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that particular piece of work by him. So yeah, it's hard for me to say. I mean, I hope they would be complementary, but I'll have to look into that. Thank you for the suggestion.
And then a second question, how do you foresee bringing your concept, your conceptualization back in Rwanda? And this person was thinking specifically about how presenting safely this nuanced concept as part of university curriculum, especially law schools and even counseling degrees, to get Rwandans' feedback and reactions to it.
Yeah, I think that's, again, quite a challenging question, because at the moment, as I mentioned, as I was sort of concluding, I don't think there is public space in Rwanda to have this kind of discussion. It's the kind of conversation I think that could prove really distressing to people, and not just sort of Tutsi genocide survivors, but also people, on other sides of the conflict as well, to kind of open up discussions of how different people were harmed and what they lost. And I think especially where it's perhaps at risk of making it seem as though perpetrators are then being given a platform, right, to talk about their crimes in ways that are intended to justify them or minimize them. I could see that being really, really problematic. So, I mean, I'm not sure it's realistic that this is something that can happen in Rwanda and be integrated into Rwandan curriculum in the near future. But as I mentioned, I mean, we see, I think, hints at times that people are starting to think about these things and talk about these things, at least within their immediate families and sort of, trusted circles of friends and stuff. So it may be possible one day. But yeah, I think just because of how sort of immediate the genocide is for a lot of people, it's something that would have to be approached, again, with great sensitivity and really carefully, I think, facilitated by people, so that, where it does get really messy, emotional, and so on, people are helped to deal with that in a productive way, rather than just being left to kind of, fester and grow resentments and these kinds of things. Because I think that's always a risk in any post-genocide context, right? That if things aren't handled in a way that benefits at least the majority of people, it can do a lot of harm, right? And set efforts at things like national unity and reconciliation back in ways that we perhaps don't intend.
Thank you for that. And another question, this one more about your methodology. You mentioned ethnography. How many months, years have you physically spent in Rwanda?
So I guess over the years, I'd have to add it all up. I mean, my initial doctoral research, this was in 2007 and 2008. So I spent a solid 8 months in the country. And I started out then basically at the genocide memorials, just observing how the memorial guides there worked, how people talked about the genocide, how they reacted to different types of conversations about the genocide, and so on. And once I felt like I'd kind of come to terms with how Rwandans talked comfortably about the genocide, if you can use the word comfortable, then I began conducting the interviews and so on. And so it was often a case of me maybe, doing an interview or two in a day with people, and mixing that then with other kinds of sort of ethnographic work. I did multiple interviews with people, so I'd go back to them at different points over the 8 months and speak to them again, assuming, of course, they were willing. And this was quite useful as well, because it allowed me to begin to sort of map changes in the way that they spoke about things. It also meant they could become a little bit more used to me being there, asking them questions, talking with them about these kinds of things. And so the narratives actually got a lot deeper over time as well. So since I finished my PhD, I mean, like a lot of people working in academia, it's mostly sort of in the summer months that I would then be going back. And often I've been limited to trips of like 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So I haven't been able to continue that sort of same level of ethnographic work. But I've continued very much, doing it in these periods and also conducting follow-up interviews. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I couldn't give you an exact number of months I've worked in the country at this point, but yeah, it's pretty well been sustained more or less consistently 2 or 3 trips a year, each year since then.
I guess the pandemic has slowed it down a bit.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, we have a question from someone who would prefer to say it. So I'm going to ask Beata to unmute if that's okay. And apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Oh, we can't hear you though, unfortunately. No. Maybe it's not coming through your microphone, unfortunately. No, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Oh, you're still muted, actually, it looks like. Let's see if I can do something on my end. Oh, that I think we might be able to hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay. My name is Beata Wazaninga, and I live in Nottingham, and I'm a survivor of Rwanda genocide against Tutsi. This has really been interesting to sit in this conversation and listen to our speakers. My question is, how many people have you really spoke to, and hearing how you speak, what you're talking about? Clearly, you haven't been really. Well, I'm not dismissing what you found. I'm only saying it will take you a long time to actually come to this kind of a conclusion. I'm sitting here as a survivor. I'm not sitting here as an expert. And personally, I would like to say that you can never be an expert in a country that you've never lived in, and feel what people felt or you felt. You're standing there as a person and asking questions. The story it happened to so many people at the time. And surviving, there's what you call surviving. It's the same thing I've seen even during the Holocaust when you look at documentaries. But you cannot say that it doesn't add up to me as a survivor, as somebody who have been there, lost my whole family. My mother was drowned. I never even buried her. And sitting here and feeling you are picking piece to pieces. Somehow for the expert, I put it, you are easily the scorer to put everything side by side, one by one. But for us as survivors, people who live there, it's black and white. Mm-hmm. For you, it's not black and white. For you, you're trying to find this boy innocent. Innocent, there's many more people innocent there. And people who killed because they're not meant to be killing. Should we be feeling sorry for this person? There is a choice to be made here. And why do you call complex? Why is it, what is complex about the fact that million people, by the way, whoever asked the number, we are Rwandans, I was there, it's more than, actually I can tell you there's a Tutsi who changed ID before the genocide, so we can go to school. We had to change identity card so we can be accepted in the school, we can be accepted into work. Those people were never counted and they were dead. And when somebody say that 500, did you say 500? that was.
I think that's the number that they came to.
No, yeah, but you are minimizing people. I'm so sorry. I'm sitting here and I was wondering whether I'm sitting in the right place. But you are sitting here deciding our history. You are sitting here deciding who we are. But I can tell you, it hurts. It hurts really deep. It hurts when I'm seeing. Yes, I'm not. It's okay. You can go and do your research. You can do whatever, but it hurts. It does hurt. And there's those people. What we are actually saying, the problem you raised, I would never have called it complex. I would call it consequence of genocide against Tutsi, because there's people who have gone through so many things. Mm. Some of us had to lie. I lied. I used to call a man my father. He was a Hutu. Imagine a Tutsi child pass by when I'm saying that man is my father, probably will see me as the daughter of that guy. So there was when surviving, there's so many, and I doubt that you have touched exactly as deep as to understand these problems. People don't have a ground of discussing all these things to engage in. Rwanda has created a massive platform for younger generation to talk about their issues. There is a gacaca, as you mentioned. There's a memorial center. There is a talks that happens every week. At the first day of a month, there is a place when people in the village meet and they talk about these issues. There is intermarriages again. Now I can tell you all who's sitting here. If you read the Strategy of Antelopes, you can see what I can't remember the guy who wrote the book. There is engagement, people going on. So I don't know whether I'm actually asking question or I'm upset, or whether I'm asking with an anger and upset. I can see the one thing I want to end on. I'm not saying that you are taking Rwanda as a far away from Europe. You are able to come and pick us piece to pieces. But actually, I bet if you were to bring the same conversation here, as in you piecing every thing happening in the Holocaust. I know there is something, you will be called something else. But in Rwanda, you're safe because we are Rwandan. And I'm upset about this, and I'm so sorry about that. I'm not talking as an expert or as an intelligent, but I can tell you one thing, there's nothing intelligent about what happened to us. I was 13. I was old enough to know what was going on. But yeah, thank you for your research. I think that was amazing.
Thank you for your comment, Beata. And yeah, I'm sorry to have upset you with the content of the paper. I mean, for what it's worth, and I mean, you can believe what I'm saying or not. It's completely up to you. With what I'm talking about here, I'm not trying to say that survivors should be forgiving perpetrators, and I'm certainly not minimizing the violence that people suffered. I mean, I would hope that also comes out of you know, both the narratives that Innocent and Berger shared with me, that you know, this violence was real, that it was genocidal, and yeah, that it merits serious consideration. And I also recognize, you know, that yes, I'm a white Canadian woman. I'm in many ways, you know, not an expert on Rwanda, especially the culture of the country and so on. And I mean, in other things that I'm writing, I do, you know, recognize this, engage with it. But, you know, one of the challenges I think we often face, I mean, certainly with history as a discipline, is that we're trying to understand history from multiple perspectives, and we recognize, and I'm trying to sort of, I guess, kind of explain this. It's trying to look at the past in a way that can be useful to the future. And one of the things I think we need, because we see efforts to prevent genocide and to support survivors in different contexts internationally fail all the time, is we need to start looking for different ways to make sense of what's happened. And that's where, you know, this paper and some of the other work that I'm doing in genocide studies is coming from. So it's not that I'm telling survivors how they should feel about the atrocities that they've experienced, and I'm certainly not telling survivors that they should be reconciling with people who've harmed them in these irreparable ways. Yeah, so I don't know if that helps, but yeah, I appreciate your feedback, I do.
There is a question actually that's I think, did Beate have something else to say? I think she's, hold on, I don't know if it's working.
No, it's, can you hear me now? No, you're okay, you're right. I think I will feel probably the same. Sometimes it's difficult to go into other people's shoes, but since, as you say, that you failed, one thing I picked on is when you say that the person asked the government, Kagame government, have said it's 1 million people, but you have to remember Kagame government is the one who was there on the first day to stop the genocide. So they can tell you whichever number, which is actually true. I'm not saying that it's a lie, but this is the government that has stopped the genocide. This is the people who are rescued the people. So therefore, the number, whoever doubts it, they can. I find it not very good. And I don't think you tell us how to feel. You're looking at it from your own eyes. Yes, international failed us. That's why I think in the way I would suggest, spend time with us more than a month, because a 1 month or 2 months or 3 months here does not make anyone expert. Spend time, ask us, learn the culture, see what happened, because Rwandan people don't talk exactly easily, as you have seen. We don't, well, maybe apart from me, they don't talk that quickly. It would take a long time to gain their trust.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I think that's all I needed to say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there is a question that is actually related, Catherine. A similar vein, how helpful or potentially dangerous or harmful is this understanding of complex role shifting to highly mediatized cases such as Paul Rusesabagina's recent trial? If you could comment on that. And I hope everybody's okay to stay on for a few more minutes. We've got just a few more questions in the chat, and I'd like to try to get to all of these if that's okay with everyone.
Sorry, Christine, could you just repeat the first part of that? I lost you for.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it might be a little bit shaky. How helpful or potentially dangerous or harmful is the understanding of complex role shifting to highly mediatized cases such as Paul?
Yeah. I mean, I think the potential for harm is a real one. I do, because I mean, yeah, with the case of somebody like Paul Rusesabagina, you have an individual who, by the international community standards, have been labeled a hero, right, with Hotel Rwanda. And again, I'm sure Catherine is intimately familiar with these things. Yeah, and then later on, I mean, it seems there's evidence to suggest that he had been supporting terrorist groups, right, that are interested in destabilizing the country and this kind of thing, destabilizing the current government. I mean, again, this is why I kind of stress it's really, I think, as a starting point for the research design, for beginning to engage with individuals, that we don't just approach them with this narrow lens on of somebody being a guilty perpetrator, right? We might end up there in the course of having conversations with people, right? We might decide, oh, this particular individual, no, like really they did just commit these crimes. They were enthusiastic ideologues and so on, right? So there might be moments in our analysis where we end up there, I think. So I'm not saying that's where we should always end up with this idea. And I'm certainly not saying we should regard everybody as morally and legally equivalent. But I do recognize that, I think, especially with individuals who deny that the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, as it's referred to in official parlance, happened, right? And people who would argue that there were multiple genocides, including genocides against the Hutu, there is the possibility that, these kinds of concepts could then be used to try to deny genocides, and not just relating to Rwanda, but in many contexts. But I think that's also a risk with any research, right? I mean, I've worked on projects not related to Rwanda, for example, where survivors' narratives, someone's come along and cherry picked out an excerpt from something they've said and then used it to argue that, well, actually they're saying the Holocaust didn't happen and though they're a survivor. So therefore, we should treat this as, evidence that the Holocaust wasn't real, right? Like, I think there are moments whenever we're putting work like this out into the public sphere and we're experimenting with new ideas, where people are giving testimonies for public audiences, there's always that potential danger that somebody's going to twist your words or use it in ways that are really, really negative, right? It's just something I think we need to be vigilant against. I mean, were that to happen, if this term was then to be turned in a way that I felt was disrespectful to survivors, denying genocide, that kind of thing, I would certainly write back against that. I would speak out against that, right? But to a certain extent, I think as work becomes public, we also kind of lose control over how it's used and manipulated by others. I hope that answers your question. I know I haven't said much about resuscitation, but sort of a roundabout way, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Okay, there's two questions from Eric. How have, this is going back to the question that Dan raised earlier, how have those who claim the numbers to be less than what the Rwandan government and survivors associations came to determine their numbers? And he was wondering if you could elaborate on the comment about why you think the Rwandan government is wanting to add up the numbers.
To be honest, I mean, again, I'm not a quantitative scientist. So how, these different scholars who are arguing that say only 500,000 Tutsi died in the genocide versus the 1 million, or I think it's 1,200,000 now in the Rwandan government's case, that they're recognizing, like, I can't give you the precise details on how those numbers were reached. I just can't. But I mean, the Rwandan government, I think it'll still be up. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission runs a website in which they talk about, I think there's actually a full report that you can download where they talk about, the numbers and all the people that have been buried every year at Kwibuka, the annual commemorations for the genocide in Rwanda. They bury more people who've been sort of identified as Rwandan genocide victims. And likewise, this forum that happened in the Journal of Genocide Research last year, that, there's a number of scholars then who are looking at, different types of evidence to try to come to terms with why they think, for example, that it would have been only 500,000 victims. So I would, rather than me giving you kind of a poor summary of their arguments, I would suggest maybe just looking to those sources and coming to a determination really yourself. But yeah, as I mentioned before, I think it really came down to just the sense that there wasn't a good, like a reliable documentation of how many Tutsi existed in Rwanda prior to the start of the genocide versus, when the genocide came to an end. And so that's where the big historical and sort of political debate is kind of happening around this lack of reliable census information and so on.
Okay, there's a question about sexual violence, that there might be a powerful gender dimension to your research, in particular episodes in which sexual violence was used as a price for survival. How should we think about such scenarios in terms of respecting those who have been through it?
Yeah, the subject in sexual violence as well is quite, obviously an extremely challenging one for people. And again, when it comes to the people that I'd interviewed over the years, where sexual violence came up, you do encounter women who admit to accepting or seeking out relationships with Hutu power extremists in the hopes of ensuring their survival, whereas other women were very much forced into these relationships. And, I think on both accounts, again, where we should end up with this is that these are criminal actions. These women were, victims and are survivors of this kind of violence, right? So in terms of where we end up, I think often there's a clear sort of line, regardless of whether a woman enters into it in a so-called willing manner or not, just because of, again, the duress, the chaos of the genocide, the extreme pressure that these women would have been under. They can't really consent to being in a relationship with these kinds of people. But again, I'm sorry to go back to this idea of it being complex, but again, this is a term that Rwandan survivors often use with me and perpetrators often use. Like, it's really complicated. It's a really complex issue. This was raised a lot in the interviews that I conducted over the years. So, there, I think, are moments where, again, survivors of this kind of violence often feel very guilty in the aftermath because of what's been to them. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying they should feel guilty, but it is a pattern that you often observe, this kind of survivor's guilt, that they were somehow complicit in their own sexual victimization. And again, this is a pattern that plays out in context beyond Rwanda, and in contexts as well that aren't necessarily genocide related even, right? That survivors, they blame themselves for what's happened to them. So again, I hope that's answered the question. But yeah, I think there's a similar pattern there to be observed in terms of people not necessarily seeing them as like innocent in these situations, even though, again, reasonable people probably would not judge them negatively for what has been done to them.
Okay, I think we have time for one last one, if you're up for it. A question from Julia about mentioning the emotional impact on researching this on you, if you care to comment. She understands that it's quite a personal question.
Sorry, can you repeat that again? It's just, I paused for a moment. I think my internet.
Sorry, if you could comment on the emotional impact that this has had on you as a researcher.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, if you don't want to, she understands it's a personal question.
No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, it's one of these things where often the focus, I think, as a researcher is more on the harms that people are navigating as like survivors of this kind of violence, right? And we don't tend to really talk much about how this kind of research affects ourselves, because I think, you know, rightly, we try to prioritize the emotional well-being and sort of mental health people we're working with. But yeah, I mean, there is a toll. I think anybody who works in this kind of field long term will find that, you know, the narratives people share with you become harder and harder, I think, over time to forget, or to kind of, you know, shift away from outside of your work life, right? And kind of trickles into your personal life and these kinds of things. And yeah, I definitely think that there's yeah, like it can lead to, I think, all sorts of mental health challenges in different ways. I mean, some people find it causes periods of depression. Some people find it, you know, helps contribute to things like burnout associated with other aspects of your job, that kind of thing. And yeah, I find over the years it's gotten harder at times to talk about certain types of violence. I do a lot more collaborative work on this kind of research, just because I find it easier to write about this stuff when I'm working with other people. You know, we can sort of share the burden of it together and find ways also of like relaxing and getting our brains off it together, rather than it just, you know, being me sitting in a room on my own writing about genocide. And yeah, there's a lot of really, really useful literature out there as well about things that genocide scholars can do to help maintain, you know, some degree of self-care and so on. And so, yeah, if the person who's asked this question is interested, you can email me, and if you want, you know, I can share some of these resources with you if you think it would be helpful in any way.
I'm looking to see if there are any other questions that I might have missed, and apologies if I did. Please give a shout. I think I might have, I've got them all. Oh, Eric is actually just sent me another link, and I actually just wondered if Eric wanted to say something. I wonder if he would mind my asking him to unmute, but maybe that's a lot. But he's just actually posted, for those who are unfamiliar with the statistics of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, they're available research that was conducted by the Ministry of Local Government in 2002, and it came up with over 1 million victims, of whom more than 98% were Tutsis. None of the researchers who dispute the over 1 million victims have ever come up with clear information to counter that. That was Eric's post, and I actually, I'm just waiting to see if he posts something else and wants me to just ask him to unmute, but maybe it doesn't seem like. But thank you, Erin. Thank you. It was really an interesting and challenging discussion, I think, and a really important one. And thank you so much for agreeing to present your work. And thank you to everyone who's participated in this discussion and in this presentation today on behalf of the research partnership. I also just wanted to say that we will be loading this onto our YouTube channel soon. If you would like to access it again, we would be very happy for you to share it and to continue the conversation. So thank you again to everyone for participating, and especially to Erin for sharing your work.
Thank you, everyone, for attending on a Wednesday night.
Thank you.